Thank you for joining us and our panel discussion on the right time to build a data stack. So in just a second, I'm going to introduce our panelists. But basically, we're going to have a panel discussion on some of these topics that you're aware of at this point. But we are going to reserve some time for a Q&A at the end. Zoom does have a Q&A feature that you should be able to see, down there. And if you would like to type any questions in at any point, we can start stacking those up. So we'll get going. For our panelists here, we have Perry Wang. Perry is currently the Group Manager, Enterprise Marketing Analytics at Atlassian, a collaboration software company that helps teams organize, discuss, and complete shared work. Before joining Atlassian, he led go-to-market and growth data teams at Intercom and Segment. Utsav Kaushish is currently the VP of Analytics at User Interviews, a startup trying to solve the hardest problems in user research, finding the right person to talk to at the right time. Prior to this, he was a data scientist at Facebook, Zenefits, and Microsoft. Utsav is based in Atlanta, Georgia. And then Peter Fishman is the CEO and co-founder of Mozart Data. He has over a decade of experience running data and data adjacent teams at startups in a variety of industries, including gaming, social, HR benefits, real estate, and cannabis. When he realized that he was building the same types of modern data stacks at each company, he teamed up with a close friend to start Mozart Data in 2020 and make it easy for anyone to gather data, automate reporting, and generate insights. He also co-founded Bacon Hot Sauce in 2010, which sold hundreds of thousands of bottles of hot sauce. So those are our panelists who we'd also like to thank for being here. And at that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Cody. Great to be here with two analytics leaders that I think are great and can really inform on the discussion. The topic for today is technically the right time to build a data stack. But before we dive into that, maybe you could give, each of you could give a little bit deeper of an intro and tell me a little bit more about your careers and kind of the specific roles within these companies that you've mostly focused on, and basically what are the infrastructure decisions and infrastructure questions that have played into those roles. So maybe we could start just taking one piece of that, and you can just dive a little bit more into the types of things you've tackled at each of the places and the impressive places that Cody's mentioned. So maybe we could start with Perry.
Yeah, thanks, Fish. Appreciate the intro. In sort of many of the roles that I've been in across Segment, Intercom, Atlassian, and even roles before, we've really focused on knowing what we know about our business, our customer, our product. How do we take those insights and actually put it in the operational hands or the actionable hands of a seller or a marketer? I think that's been, as we've moved towards cloud-based software, how do we do better product-led growth by feeding those insights to our sellers at the right place, at the right time, for the right message? And a really important part is setting up the right data stack, having the right flows of information to enable that to do well.
Great.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a pretty clear split. As Cody mentioned, I've worked at two very, very big companies, Facebook and Microsoft, and I've worked at two startups, Zenefits and User Interviews, where I am currently. Facebook and Microsoft, kind of the stack, the data infrastructure was mostly in place, and the role was very much about understanding how the product gets used, running a lot of experiments to understand which version of something we should end up going with. And then Zenefits, where I worked with Fish, and we actually started the data team. And then I've done the same thing at User Interviews. It was very much just getting the infrastructure off the ground. So, before we started, it's really hard to answer questions like how many users do we have? How much money are we making? Like very fundamental things that you need to know. And if there were ways to calculate those things, they were really hard and took a long time. They weren't automatic. And so at User Interviews and Zenefits, I would say the first year at least was just, getting those things up to speed. And then fortunately we've made progress, and now we're getting into more of the Facebook, Microsoft type questions where we, run experiments, do analyses, understand how people use the product, things like that.
So you both kind of have touched on, you've both been at really impressive, late stage companies. You've seen kind of data stacks grow up. You've been at, public companies, which have, basically deal with the biggest data sets in the world. So, kind of, that experience, I think most of our audience and most of the folks that we think about at Mozart Data are more on the small side. So, you've had the opportunity to see what like great looks like, or even the sort of steps to great. What does it look like early on? And, obviously, let's of you have some very relevant experience at this very recently. Perry, you're a bit removed from that, but I'd be curious to hear, we'll start with us this time and then go to Perry. What does it look like early on?
So what does great look like early on?
No, what are what's the initial kind of seedling that's going to get them to great? I think you both have a lot of experience in seeing what a mature stack and like a high performance organization looks like. But we think really deeply about the early kind of experience. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I've been lucky in a couple ways. One, seeing it at Facebook and Microsoft, but the other was my experience at Zenefits. And I think we'll touch on this later, but just mistakes we made early on at Zenefits. I was definitely more ready for it, user interviews. But early on, I think it's just about getting the tools set up as fast as you can. And honestly, I think the goal should be weeks. I think, the tools nowadays make this so easy that you can get it up and running in weeks. And then to me, I always measure analytics success. It's not like we're selling things we can't measure how much sales revenue I brought in. So I measure analytics success by the impact I'm having on other teams. So those early days, you've got the stack set up, and then I think it's super important to validate everything you're doing. So if we're ingesting all this Salesforce data about how much our sales team is selling, it's going back to the sales team and making sure that things are accurate and understanding those correctly. Same with all the product data. Maybe you have a tool like Zendesk and you're ingesting operations data. It's really making sure that you're understanding everything correctly before you can start adding value, because you certainly don't want to mislead anyone with inaccurate data. But as soon as that process is underway, I think success is getting those teams to buy in and use data. So automating things that used to be manual, getting teams to track things that before they couldn't track, coming up with metrics of success that now they can just look at a dashboard, whereas before maybe it was like a really inefficient Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheet. Now you can have automated in your BI tool, just saving hours that way. So yeah, measuring the impact you have on every other team, I think super important as your like kind of North Star when you first start out.
Perry?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Nowadays it is much easier to get started. You have, many different data warehouse technologies on how to store your information. It's much easier to get started on that than how things were 10 years ago. And even in terms of the analytics, right? We have tools like Segment, Mixpanel, Amplitude that are really plug and play to see what are users doing on your website, what are the things that make sense. I think the early on in terms of the data stack is kind of understanding, in addition to what Utsav said in terms of measuring what's going on, is also understanding what are users doing in your product, right? What are the behaviors that we expect them to be doing? How do we measure for that value? The best things that I think analytics can do is help the team see that framework, that operational model, and be able to measure the key steps that matter. I think one of the things that we've looked at from Segment is when you get started and you wanted to sign up for an integration, it's not just important to measure how many people start the integration sign up flow, and who connect and end up sending data, but how are you doing in terms of all the intermediary steps? Are we seeing folks that are getting stuck at the authorization level? Are we seeing folks getting stuck at the implementation stage for new code changes? It's important that the data stack gives us visibility into that information. In the early days for your startup, your PM, your engineers are going to be obsessed about getting access to that data, and how do you build, kind of like Utsav said, like for self-serve is really important, but it's also like focus on the things as an analytics person on what matters and sort of leave room for a really invested team to also start exploring with the data to get started.
So Perry, I want to double click into one thing. You have some experience doing analytics, ironically, at Segment. Can you talk about literally how Segment, or a tool like Segment, helps teams get started?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And just for everyone on the call, Segment is a way for web-based companies and digital companies to simplify the event tracking that's important to every step of the product. So users that are on your marketing site, your public site, users that are in your mobile app or inside your in-app experience, Segment allows you to track all of that with one a consolidated tracking system, and then send it to all the tools that you need. So if you use Mixpanel or if you use Salesforce or Marketo, you can implement things once and then send it to all of your tools. This is great because in the early days, there are limited engineering resources, right? You're focused on product market fit, you're focused on product areas where you want to build new features. So it's difficult sometimes to get the engineering cycles to build tracking, to build implementation. Segment enables a lot of that to start quickly and move quickly. For us, we use Segment for everything internally, right? Like the engineering teams built it for the website, built it for the in-app experience. We were plug and play using a variety of tools like Amplitude, Indicative to start exploring what was going on in our user flows and product flows. What's great for the team at the time is those tools are very much out of the box once you have a tracking system like Segment or RudderStack set up. RudderStack is a very similar tool to Segment in that regard. And it lets the analytics team kind of focus on, well, what are the important business metrics to measure? And for us, that was, what's the right way for us to count revenue coming out of our subscription revenue services with Stripe? And then how do we define what is a customer? What is a retained customer? What is a lost customer? So you're able to sort of focus on not just how the data is stored and how the data is read, but what are the operating parts of the business that need that data? And how do we define it so that you define it once, it's consistent, sales, marketing, product are all using the same definitions, and then you're aligned as a business on those.
I mean, I think that was a really great description. One of the commonalities that I hear with you and Utsav as I sort of pose questions about, quote, the right time to build a data stack is, as you sort of remember building that stack, you're talking so much about problems that you're solving as opposed to literally the data infrastructure itself. One, I happen to think that's a real sign of like a great practitioner. So too often people think of these in isolation as the sort of the steps that I need. You should be thinking about effectively the problems. With that, can I turn to you? And obviously Perry was able to talk about a tool like Segment. Can you talk a little bit about sort of, one, why is it that you talk about solving problems, as opposed to literally the infrastructure itself? And two, the types of infrastructure that you really prioritize and focus, after kind of implementing something like Segment.
Yeah, I think it starts with the problems. It's sort of, like I said, we make an analytics people, we make an impact by influencing other teams' roadmaps. So if you set up this infrastructure and then nothing valuable comes out of it, no analyses, no dashboards, you might as well not have set it up at all, right? It might be cool to talk about, but it's probably just collecting dust, costing money. So yeah, there is, I think, a right time and to start thinking about this, and that's when you have problems you want to answer. Like Perry mentioned, retention, I think is super important to do early on, right? Start understanding what keeps people coming back, either on a contract or just to your website. Yeah, I think, at Zenefits, we started right before our Series C fundraising. So that was, that inspired the co-founders and everyone to start collecting data so we could be ready for our fundraising round. In hindsight, that was probably a little bit too late. And then, user interviews, I was the 14th employee. And before our Series A, and we were really ready to go by the time we wanted to raise money. Yeah, I think early on the problems you're solving are super valuable. Retention, understanding what metrics you care about, setting up those key dashboards, and that's when those things become important, then I think you've got to start developing the tools and building your data platform. Otherwise, it's not really accomplishing anything and probably not the best use of a startup's time.
Great. One thing I do want to just remind the audience about is we do have, I feel like two experts in these topics, and feel free to add questions to the Q&A. I do want to we will take time at the end, as Cody mentioned, to answer some questions. But as things pop up, don't hesitate to put questions into the Q&A. Utsav, I'd love to transition to one of my favorite topics. So you two as experts have a lot of sort of success stories. It's like, well, we started looking at this and then great things happened and the company made better decisions, then everybody ended up happy and successful. I don't want to hear about those. I want to hear about mistakes that you make along the way. So, obviously you and I had a shared experience at a company called Zenefits. I think many of the data decisions made there were good for the time that we made them. But I'd love to hear about kind of what I would call just generally mistakes in terms of implementing a data stack or mistakes of sort of this sort of data function or data group, and how it played out maybe at the company. I think too often people are like, well, I did this thing and this thing and this thing, and this is the right way of doing it, and therefore great things happened. And I think that that's just not really how things play out. You want to share a little bit about some of your experiences there?
Sure, I can start. So two come to mind. I think one I touched on, we were probably called in a little too late to start this stuff at Zenefits. So I remember 6 weeks after I started, we submitted our fundraising materials. And so we had to build everything up while we were analyzing it. And we were just constantly discovering new things about our data. So I think that would be the first recommendation, is just understand it takes a lot of time to really understand data you start ingesting. So when we get our Salesforce data into our data warehouse, it's you really need to understand what the close date represents, right? Is that human generated or is that automated? Can it change in the future? It's something we really had to figure out and learn the hard way. The other, I think, a mistake we probably made at Zenefits, and then I think I repeated at user interviews, was just in under investing in what most people probably call data engineering. I think transformation is another term. You get data from a lot of different sources, and if you're good enough at SQL, you can write the query just joining all these data sets together, and it's sort of, it saves you time in the short term, but it's more error prone, and then it makes it much harder to onboard new people when they have to sift through 100 lines of code for one query. And I probably underinvested in doing that kind of pre-processing ahead of time on a schedule through some kind of transformation tool, so that the end user doesn't have to write 100 lines when they could do it in 5. And then I think along the lines of transformations, another thing we underinvested in was what we call snapshot tables. So say you have a table of revenue, and today is March 30th, and let's say we say revenue is $1 million. And on April 15th, we have to issue a correction and say revenue is only $900,000. And if you've ever been there, it's a very big deal when you have to update revenue numbers, and people are going to ask, why are you now saying it's different? And if you have a snapshot table, basically a copy of the table on March 30th, you can go back and see what was different. I can say, oh, this contract was invoiced at some number. On April 3rd, we updated that invoice to a smaller number. That's why revenue now looks smaller. We were incorrect about the invoice in March. And it just helps you get ahead of those questions that are very good, legitimate questions, and can be pretty scary and hard to answer if you're not ready for them. So yeah, I think don't wait until you absolutely have to build up a data stack and a data team, and also don't underinvest in the things that will make your analyst's life easier.
Perry, I'm sure you've never made an error in your career, but if you had to share one that you've at least heard about, what are some common mistakes that you've seen? I mean, I'm sure that the Utsav story of a revenue number changing on you is not the first time you've heard of that. And obviously a number of challenges, especially from the operations side.
Oh, for sure. I think it resonates a lot, right? The two numbers that you care about the most are how many customers do we have today? how many customers, and how much revenue do we have today? And it would surprise you how many companies, not just the ones that we've worked for, but companies all over who are in early stages, just like, we actually don't know how much money we technically made 2 weeks ago. We can tell you how much we had today because we can report live on it, but going backwards using snapshot data just isn't there. If I still remember correctly, a long time ago, before the modern data stack, I worked at a company where we used a Microsoft Office Excel plugin for Salesforce to snapshot all of our opportunity data into an Excel file, and then upload it into a Microsoft Access database that's snapshotted every day, that was manually run, that I ran at 450 every day. Luckily, nowadays we have tools that do that sort of data extraction to solve for that. But that's certainly a huge benefit of planning ahead, basically. For us, the thing that changes a lot is making sure that the teams are defined on the same definitions early. I think both at Intercom and Atlassian and Segment, like, we've had cases where product teams, marketing teams, business teams may all have slightly different definitions on what is this objective that we're driving towards. If we're trying to sell a new product, do we only care for companies that are over 1,000? Or do we care for all companies when we try to sell this new product? And I think being clear on those definitions early is really important. Without a data stack, you want to rely on something like a locked Confluence page or a Notion page that says, hey, this is exactly how we're counting it. Use this SQL snippet. This is the way to go. With new tools in the data stack, exactly as Utsav mentioned, like a transformation tool, define it in your data layer so it's locked in and the teams can sort of know what it is today and rely on that. I remember in the days before dbt, which is a tool that helps you define transformations and run them on your data system, we were doing this in a BI tool called Mode Analytics. They had scheduled reports, and we would create tables using the scheduled reports feature, and that was the way that we ran ETLs. I think using the new tools today to really lock in those definitions, make sure that sales, marketing, product, everyone's talking about the same metric the same way, and you're removing all the context thrash when my number says 21 and yours number says 19, who's correct? And we spend half a day, 2 days sort of trying to figure out who's different, when it all was, we ran the numbers at different times of the day, one at 9 a.m., one at 12 p.m., and it went up by 2.
So yeah, I think data inconsistency is just such a common problem.
Sorry, your audio or your mic went out for a second, but I think you're back.
Yeah, so I think just data inconsistency is just a very common problem, and I think it's one of the it's sort of one of the good states, which is like you've actually achieved something, and now your problem is that you've almost achieved too many things, and sometimes it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So sometimes when you get inconsistent answers, you end up really doing more harm to your sort of data organization. But at the very least, you've gotten to the point of inconsistent answers. A couple of things that I pulled out of your answers that I want to talk about.
One thing that I actually would also add, Fish. Yeah, I'd also add, like, oftentimes when you're early on, even as you're approaching how to set up your data stack or what to put in your data stack, is not to put the technology or the solution first. Think about, what is the business problem you're solving for from first principles? How do you want that data to work together before you say, like, oh, we have to use HubSpot for CRM, or we have to use Salesforce for CRM. Put the problem first rather than the solution or the technology.
I think like that's been a pretty common theme of again, we have a webinar going on right now called The Right Time to Build a Data Stack. And so much of what we're talking about are the questions, the sort of future problems you'll face, the sort of the connection to the business, which is really kind of, it's not a mistitled webinar. It's just that you can't have one without the other. One of the things that I want to pull out of Utsav's question is, he mentioned that he was basically employee like 300 at Zenefits, but he, in one of the earliest data hires, and then he was employee number 14 at User Interviews, and also one of the earliest data hires. So can we talk about kind of, the right time to build the data stack is not divorced from when that first data hire occurs. Why is it that, Utsav used to be employee number 300 and today, he's employee number 14?
Yeah, from my own experience, I think there's a couple things. One, I think it's just companies are picking up on the value faster, and they probably, in hindsight, wish they had started hiring earlier. The other, I think, like we talked about, the tools now make it so that you can hire one person and they can accomplish quite a bit. So I was hired in September of 2018, and then we didn't add someone to the analytics team until I want to say February 2020, basically a year and a half after I was hired. And just by myself, I'm not an engineer. I can write SQL and that's about it. And some of the statistics programming languages. But I was able to get started because the tools they don't require degrees in computer science. You don't need a separate database administrator like maybe you would back in the day. The time to make transformations is much shorter, so you don't need as many data engineers as you would back in the day. So I think that's why when I got hired, the company had confidence that they told me you're not going to have a team for a long time. Do you think you can still accomplish things? And then again, from our experience at Zenefits, just knowing how to set up the stack and it's not that hard. I really think if I can do it, then most people can. And I that paid off for us, that we didn't build an analytics team for a year and a half, but we were still measuring things accurately, and we were ready to go when we wanted to expand the analytics team.
Great. I first of all love the opportunity to just do a quick Mozart plug, but also more broadly, kind of the modern tooling. One of the things that has come about, and I love it, almost a layup, is that the tooling has gotten better. I mean, I've heard both you and both Perry and Utsav mention, back in the day, back in my day. I feel like I can do that. I feel like you two are, it always feels twice as bad to hear you say that. But back in the day, it was an incredibly expensive endeavor to get started on analytics. And today it's mostly a credit card swipe. And also the tools involved hiring, very expensive data engineers and folks that really had that expertise in moving that data around. And today, through modern tooling, including Mozart, so much of that can be done by the business user. So much of that can be done very intuitively with a pretty low bar from a technical perspective. And that's amazing, because now companies are competing earlier and earlier on their ability to consume and analyze and understand and digest and turn that into impact their data, as opposed to literally just the Herculean task. I mean, Perry was describing something incredibly ugly, from back in the day, just the Herculean task of essentially just even getting the data. So certainly modern tooling has a big part of it. Perry, what do you see as the trend of analytics folks being hired earlier and earlier, or joining companies and having that impact? Even it could be on a team, even at a bigger and bigger company. Where do you see the sort of role of a data person in that respect?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that stuff. Like more you're seeing teams hire an analyst early because the data is there, right? You used to be able to get to 300 people and be like, oh, well, the data is somewhere in our system of record, but it's not necessarily in a data warehouse. We may not have necessarily plugged in a BI tool or an analytics tool on top of it. We're using something out of the box like Mixpanel. And like, do we really need an analyst, right? But now, because we have that wealth of information, we always have been saying, not just data practitioners, but business, like all the business journals and everyone who's in finance have always said data is power, right? Like data is information, is knowledge, gives you leverage on what's working, what's not working. Companies are looking to analysts to say, is this number good? Are we doing well? And why are we not doing well, or why are we doing well? I think when you frame it that way for growing the business, it's super important to have someone as part of the team understanding, what is actually happening in the business? Does it actually matter that retention is 60%? Like, is that good or is that bad? And I think because there's more data, there's more signal we can look at, we can actually say, hey, this is good, we should care about this. Or, retention is 60%, but we have a lot bigger drop off from sign up to first usage. So let's focus on that instead. And we're giving a partner to product managers, product leaders, to marketing leaders, to really know what's important, what's not important, to figure out in those early days when every step, every day sort of matters.
All right, so you had a chance to share kind of some of the context of how you use data and sort of when you use data, but let's dive a little bit into the nerdy nitty gritty. Would love to just hear about kind of what are the steps in terms of implementing a data stack, right? So, obviously I have the perspective of what it's involved with a tool like Mozart, but maybe just at the highest level, what are the sort of incremental, I think what I'm hoping is if you're, a practitioner on this call, maybe you're very data savvy, you've worked either, with companies with great data, and now you're sort of starting to get your data off the ground. What are the important, critical, like sort of landmarks, plateaus, whatever it is, what's the sort of roadmap? And by the way, like every company is going to be a little bit different, B2B, B2C, DTC, like they're all going to have like slight nuances, but what are the really mission critical parts? And then we'll finally get around to answering the question of the when. But first, tell me the kind of what you think of as the critical steps. So maybe I'll go to Utz first.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I think I'd start with why do we need this at all? So if you think of a tool like Salesforce, Salesforce has built-in tools where you can understand, how many opportunities are getting created. Not too familiar with Zendesk, but I'm sure there's ways to visualize how many tickets get created. And Stripe can tell you how many contracts get canceled. But let's say I want to put that all together and do this retention analysis Perry and I have been talking about, and I want to understand what predicts whether someone's going to cancel or not. Maybe I want to know what's the impact of additional Zendesk tickets on the likelihood that they're going to churn or not. Maybe I want to know, was this an inbound lead or an outbound lead? And that data is in Salesforce. So the reason it's important to have a kind of a centralized data tool, data warehouse, is so we can start answering questions like that. Otherwise, I'm sure there might be ways to make Stripe talk to Salesforce and Zendesk, but those sound really hard to me. And the modern data stack principles are pretty easy. So in terms of the steps, I think there's like 3 fundamental pillars. So our stack has grown over time, but September 2018, when I first started, there were 3, I think, fundamental pillars that we needed. One, we start with the data warehouse. So all the information you want out of Salesforce, Zendesk, Stripe, we want to put that in the centralized location. We went with Amazon Redshift because that's what we had at Zenefits. And I felt a lot of pressure to get started early, so I went with what I was familiar with. But it's worked really well for us. So set up Redshift does not take that long at all. Then you've got to start getting data into the warehouse. So again, tools like Mozart help out with this. Back in 2018, we set up a tool called Fivetran, which is very plug and play, don't need any kind of engineering. So you tell Fivetran, this is my Salesforce credentials, get me my Salesforce data, drop it off into Redshift. Again, super easy. And then the final pillar is you need a way to analyze that data, right? So say now I want to understand are inbound companies more likely to churn or outbound. And so you need a business intelligence tool that can do that for you. Lots of great options. Perry mentioned Mode Analytics, which we've used from the start. We use that at Zenefits. I'm a big fan. Lets you do a lot of things like these kinds of higher level analyses, but also lets you do simple charting like you would in Tableau or Looker. Yeah, like I mentioned, we've added tools on since then, but I think to get started, you need some form of those 3.
Perry, anything to add? Kind of key sort of milestones in the journey?
I think those are the 3 pillars, right? Like somewhere to store the information, some service that moves the data around between Salesforce, Zendesk, your finance systems like Stripe or Bill.com, and then a tool to enable the analyst to start looking and consuming at this data. You can definitely think about other tools that are also plug and play in this environment, like Mixpanel, Amplitude, that are less SQL driven. They have a lot of value as well. But I think what we'll always come back to is the information between all these systems, it should be the same, right? And the system of record for sales is Salesforce, but that information being represented in a data warehouse lets you do really creative analysis on, hey, we sold really well these 400 opportunities last quarter. What was, what product feature actually drove that better conversion? And the only way to do that is move the data into a data warehouse, unify your multiple systems of record data together to look at that. Those plug and play tools will continue to have a really good purpose for sort of frontline business teams who need something that's more self-discoverable or self-serve. Dashboards can also do a lot of that. But in the early days, your analyst capacity is your limiting factor, right? Like building the right dashboards, easily consumable data so business teams can get started. The best way to do that is those three pillars, like Utsav mentioned, warehouse, pipeline, and then BI layer to consume that information.
And nowadays there's a really rich set of tools as your organization gets bigger. But those three core pillars that you both sort of hit on kind of scale to the largest organizations in the world, right? So, having a powerful data warehouse, obviously is something that will ultimately, get you to where you need to be when you're a tiny company, but also you should feel like you're sort of in it for the long haul and have that capability. Great. One of the things that I did want to call out is, I think, Cody went through your backgrounds, but, while you've done sort of everything in the world of analytics, Perry, you sort of sit more on the business and operations and finance and, sort of making those organizations hum and move quickly with their data. But you have sort of more of a product analytics background. Perry's mentioned some product analytics tools, but your background is in, like you said, experimentation and product analytics, but you both sort of, landed on the same very important things. Maybe you could speak to how each of those sort of sub-disciplines of sort of data and analytics, maybe either require different tools or the same tools or the same questions or different questions. Maybe I'll start with you, Perry.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes analytics on the go-to-market side always a fun challenge is that tools like Salesforce, Marketo, Salesforce Marketing Cloud, they have built-in reporting features, right? Those tools are designed to give certain amounts of data intelligence to the end user. But usually that's not enough, right? Like you want to know what product signals are actually driving those deals to convert. How should we be adding product, web visits, customer engagement conversations to the marketing campaigns that we do? So from the go-to-market side, the analytics problem is often, let's understand the process by which we go to market. How do we talk to our customers? How do we engage to our customers? And what is the relevant data points that we need to inject at that conversation? Very standard, typical email marketing campaign is on day 3, if you haven't used the product, let's send you a message, right? Like, how do we get that signal? Well, we have to send product information into your marketing system so that you can trigger that message. When we did this for Intercom, we use a lot of the built-in Intercom nurture flows to do that and share that information so that we can send the message. And it's really just sort of like, you have this business process you want to operationalize and do it well. How do you plug in the right data signals in the synthesized form to that, to those steps in the process so that the operations hum and can deliver value, get the right customers in the door, send the right leads to the right sellers. All of that without data and without a system that works together becomes very manual, very tedious, very prone for, I thought we sent this lead, but no, we didn't receive this lead. And you get into a conversation where did this lead actually go? Which removes analytics and sort of takes the focus from the business off of generating revenue, winning customers, and focuses on parts of the system that aren't humming together.
And Utz, on the product side?
Sorry, for some reason I can't quite hear you sometimes, but my guess is same question. Yeah, I think for product analytics, Perry's mentioned a couple tools like Mixpanel, Amplitude, Heap, that can kind of, your engineers put snippets of code on your website, and then these events get fired off into, let's say, Mixpanel. That's one I'm most familiar with. And then someone who doesn't know SQL can go and understand, how many people hit this part of the website, what's the funnel conversion rate for, let's say, the sign up flow. And I think those tools are really good for non-analytics professionals, so product managers, marketing leaders who don't know SQL as well. I do think eventually you hit a wall in the kinds of questions you can answer in those tools. So for me, that's the distinction. There's really good product analytics tools for non-data professionals to get quite a bit done without being blocked by the data team, or maybe they don't even have a data team at that stage. But I actually feel pretty, I'm almost agnostic as a data analyst. The data comes in and it's all rows and columns once it's in your data warehouse, right? You join the data the same way, you aggregate it the same way, you feed it into your visualization tools the same way. And I think, eventually you develop a skill that can be applied to all different types of problems, not just product or marketing. Understanding how to translate ambiguous questions into something we can quantify, doing the programming, the SQL, putting together good visualizations. I think those skills kind of transcend just like one domain. You do develop a lot of domain knowledge, but like you said, I work primarily in product analytics at Facebook and Microsoft. So got really good at setting metrics, running A/B tests, having instincts for whether an A/B test was going well or not, if there's what the follow-up questions are. That's all domain knowledge, but I think the tools are the same and kind of the process of getting there is the same.
Great. Okay, so because the conversation has been flowing, we haven't had a chance to actually answer the question, when is the right time? We have 2 minutes before I want to turn to audience Q&A, so maybe we'll go a little bit over, but then we'll hit some Q&A before our session ends. But I want to ask, of course, the title question, which is, when is the right time to do this? And also, how do I know if I'm ready? Let's go.
I can
first. Go. Yeah.
Well, I think the right time is employee number 14. No, I think I always say you need a product, whether you're a software company, you have engineers, or you're making something in the physical world. You need a product that's being sold, and then you need to get the word out. So you need marketers, maybe a salesperson or two. So I think analytics typically follows those roles, but as soon as you're starting to wonder, as soon as you want to accurately answer how much money did we make, how many customers do we have, and you realize what a burden it is for someone to have to like query a MySQL database directly instead of being able to do that through a BI tool. That's what I think. So 14, maybe a little bit early. I don't think it's that early. I think, at that point we had a few engineers, we had a marketing team, and those questions were starting to get answered. So it felt like good timing.
I think very much similarly, like when you are starting to ask the questions of how do I start to connect my marketing activities to my sales outcomes? How do I connect my product launch to my sales outcomes, or sales outcomes and feedback back in my product development cycle? That's where having the analysts on hand, having the analytics leader to sort of sift through, help you understand what are the right questions to ask becomes super important. I think if you think about the data stack, in its simplest form, it's a tool like Google Analytics, right? Just very simply telling you how many people are landing on your website, where they're coming from. And that could be a great place to start. I think that fit for purpose really changes as your company starts to evolve the types of questions it needs to ask to continue to grow. And it comes quickly, right? Like at some point, Stripe built-in reporting starts to hit walls. Built-in reporting in Salesforce starts to hit walls. You need Salesforce administrators to move data into Salesforce to continue. And to make it easier, you sort of unblock all of those gates, create a data warehouse, set up those pipelines, build the BI tools for it. It's usually right in the 10, 20 to 50 stage. If you're looking at data past 50 and past 50 employees, the data stack that you've had probably still works. But the question that I will always ask is, are you leaving insights on the table that you're not asking because there's not an analyst help you sift through the right questions, or pointing out like where we should be taking the data stack in a different direction to make it more flexible and intuitive for all of the data that you have.
All right.
Yeah, and I'll add really quickly, if you're at 20, 25 employees and the idea of building a data team seems daunting, which is very fair, just what we talked about earlier, like don't underestimate what one person can accomplish just with the new tools, and probably won't be as much of a burden to build that kind of team as a lot of people think.
Yeah, it's been really great. I think the movement with modern data stack, just the really shift in towards more data for more decisions has elevated data to sort of a first order function and first order craft within companies. I think for a lot of our careers, early on, or even in other industries, data is always viewed as a byproduct of what we build in product, or a byproduct of what marketing campaigns we run. But that data is just as important to know that we're doing well as it is to know that if we're not doing well, why it's not doing well. So I think the organizations are starting to hire for data earlier, starting to ask better data questions earlier, and it's all good things.
Amazing. Well, we've managed to only go 3 minutes over, which with me is always, feels like we're actually 2 minutes under. So let me sort of take this now as an opportunity to dive into some audience questions. Again, feel free to add some questions. We'll go for another 7 or 8 minutes and sort of end promptly. And then, obviously, if there are any follow-ups, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Pete@MozartData.com, if you have any sort of follow-up, and I'll happily direct you to Perry or answer it myself. One thing that I wanted to add to the last question is sort of a very tight variant on what Perry says, and what we tend to say at Mozart Data is that when you start to have 2 data sources, that's the time, right? So kind of like Utsav and Perry have said over and over and over again, there is great BI tooling within your SaaS tools that are generating data. If you want to know, how many customers, if you're a D2C company and you want to, ask Shopify, how many customers do I have? They have a time series of customers. If you want to, ask Stripe what your revenue is, if you want to look at Salesforce and say, how many opportunities do I have? They have built-in reporting. It's when you sort of have 2 sources. If you want to look at, say, your Salesforce opportunities and understand, what are they doing in my application? And maybe that's going to inform kind of how aggressively you'll go after that opportunity, or what your expected lifetime value is on that opportunity. Or maybe you get that opportunity from a certain channel and you want to sort of analyze the efficacy of that channel. When you have 2 or more sources, that's really the time that we really sort of believe that you should be putting in lightweight data infrastructure. So you don't need the systems that Utsav used at Facebook or Perry uses at Atlassian. You need the types of systems that can sort of answer the questions. And my answer is very similar to what those folks said. I've now actually eaten up the whole overtime, and now I want to turn and ask an audience question. And Utsav, you hinted at this. Who should be owning this in my organization, especially if I don't have somebody like one of you? The question is basically, who should own this? Now, obviously, if there's somebody with the title, VP of Analytics, like Utsav, like that's a pretty straightforward question. What happens when we don't have that person?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say try to hire that person. The reason, this isn't really something that can live with engineering or marketing or product. The whole point is now we have all these systems talking to each other, right? And when you hire an analytics person, the principle is like, get the data right. And we're not going to prioritize one way or the other. It's whatever makes the data right. I can see issues arising if, like, product and marketing and engineering, we're supposed to be making their lives easier, and adding, owning 3 tools makes it, I think, quite a bit harder. If you really, really can only afford the tools and not a person, I'm not even really sure how to answer it. Maybe someone in engineering and like the technical background, but my very strong advice would be hire someone to own it.
Perry?
I think very similar, like you need someone to be the champion for the data stack, right? Not only to ask the right questions, but also how should it start to connect? What sources are important? You might not want to connect Salesforce to product data right away, and that's okay, right? You might want to connect Salesforce data to Stripe or your billing system. But you kind of have to figure out where to start. I think in some organizations, because your first questions you ask are, how many customers did we have last month? Or how much revenue did we make? It makes sense to start it in finance in some cases, and you'll likely have someone on the finance team early. But if you're asking how many customers we have and what customers are using what features, then you may want to lean and put analytics as a function within product. But irrespective of where you place it, there's the person helping you answer the question, figure out what other questions to ask, and then there are team members helping you construct the pipelines. And even if the modern data stack is easy, you typically you'll need support from engineering to move some product data along. So making sure that there's dedicated capacity and planned capacity on those teams to help is going to be really important. You don't want to be trying to set up a data warehouse and then realize, oh, I need 2 engineers to help move some of this data over that isn't already there. It's easy to set up once and just let it run, but making sure you have capacity to do that.
Nice. Well, we finally hit like a point of disagreement. So I think Utsav feels one way, Perry feels another way, and I feel even more extreme. So I think that you can actually, solve this in an organization without sort of an explicit, analytics title, a data analyst, data scientist, data engineer. I've seen, we've seen through Mozart data a lot of success in terms of the sort of citizen data scientist, the business savvy analyst that maybe it's somebody with an FP&A background that's, an Excel or G Sheets wizard that really can start thinking about the data now or get that sort of repeated process out of their data that typically would involve a lot of sort of work in one of those sort of more spreadsheet tools. I've seen that on the marketing side and the product side. I sort of agree with Perry, which is this function can live a number of places. It just takes somebody that's incredibly passionate about finding those answers and finding sort of, valuable insights. Now, where I will agree with Utsav is that, sort of to really make this a scaled function and to really look at its best, you want somebody with, essentially some training there or almost some obsession with, or sort of a singular sort of job title and focus that is going to be around, building out and tending to that data.
You want someone with a mandate to care for it.
Yeah, I think that that's sort of universal across the company, which is data will only be as successful as the fact that there's a mandate there to make it, a part of decision making, or through your work you create that mandate. So I think that was sort of one of the table stakes. Again, I do want to. We have a quick question. Hopefully we can get it to it. How much maintenance or ongoing work have you typically seen in sort of maintaining the stack versus the initial setup of the stack?
For me, it's almost none. So the initial setup, like I said, takes a couple weeks, maybe a little bit less. The maintenance is almost none. I will say there's maintenance that happens in transformations. When you start building out custom tables, very often those have to get updated. An underlying table changes, the downstream table breaks. So I'm kind of dissociating transformations from the stack itself. So, Fivetran, Redshift, almost none. It's very rare, I would say.
Yeah, I think the only times I've seen challenges in maintaining the stack is when your data volumes start really blowing up. That will, you'll see that in symptoms as like my queries are running slower, or data is maybe not in the system when you expect it. But that's on the order of hundreds of thousands of Salesforce records or records from Marketo trying to sync to your warehouse. Or if you have data tables in Redshift or Snowflake that are not optimized for fast querying or sort of data partitioned, that definitely makes it difficult. But you're getting that data from your engineers, your product setup, and if it's set up correctly, very little maintenance on the sort of foundation part of the stack, mostly on the transformation side as well as where I've seen it.
I have a slightly different answer. So I think it is nice to say it's set it and forget it. Obviously, at Mozart Data, we maintain that we're basically a set it and forget it tool. In practice, you will see data pipelines break in a number of these tools, and what you'll get is a really odd answer. Like, okay, how many customers did we gain last quarter, and then it'll return 0. And what that tells you is that basically a data pipeline is broken. So while there's not much like maintenance from an infrastructure side, that's been taken care of by the modern data stack. You still see sort of the work of sort of figuring out where might a data issue be arising from. And that's kind of, I think they answered the question correctly by the letter of the law, but I would say that there's probably some data investigations that are sort of the ongoing work to maintain sort of data integrity at the company. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Cody.
Yeah, well, that kind of wraps up our conversation on the right time to build a data stack. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And then thank you, Utsav and Perry, for your time and your insights here. I think this has been, super valuable to hear your perspectives on this topic. So if anybody who attended does have any further questions, we're going to be sending out an email with a link to this recorded webinar, so you can revisit this. But always feel free to reach out to anybody here at Mozart. You can contact us on our website at mozartdata.com. And if you felt like you were learning a lot about this topic and you want to know more about, kind of how to implement a modern data stack, check out our resources page. In particular, the Startup's Guide to the Modern Data Stack is something that might be valuable to you. And with that, thank you, everybody, and we'll end the webinar here.